Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that focuses on race and the phenomenon of racial passing. I am referring to Passing by Nella Larsen, which was published in 1928. For those who don't know, Nella Larsen was an American author who lived between the late 1800s and the mid 1900s. She was known for writing only a couple books. She wrote like 2 books and a couple short stories in her lifetime. And it's one of those things where like she might have written only a few, but boy howdy, what did she write? She was known for writing books about race, specifically race and women, the idea of passing, which might relate to the fact that she was a biracial woman herself, and that she could often pass as white. And she did in her nursing career. She was able to work in white houses and white communities, and sometimes nobody ever, called attention to her race. But she was in addition to doing that kind of like it's a side thing, she also wrote. It might be the fact that, for a black woman, like there weren't that many like writing opportunities out there. And so she took them wherever she could get them, but she mainly focused on her nursing career. But regardless, like what she wrote is pretty amazing, especially the book, which I'm going to talk a lot about today because it's so fascinating and whatnot. I'm going to definitely recommend it to you out there. I strongly urge you to read it before listening to this video or watching this video, just because I'm going to spoil a lot of things about it, and I want you to get that fresh, unspoiled kind of perspective of the book before you watch this. But without further ado, let's talk about Passing. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Passing focuses on Irene Redfield mostly, and a little bit on her friend Clare Kendry. At the start of the story, Irene Redfield, who is a light-skinned black woman who has the ability to pass, she receives a letter from her friend Clare. I say friend in quotes because it's clear that she does not like Clare for a number of reasons. She's too bold. She's not a friend to the racial cause. And she has a lot of weird sort of opinions. But Claire is also a light-skinned black woman. And when she receives the letter, she recalls meeting Claire for the first time in Chicago. Irene stopped at the Drayton Hotel, and she found that Claire was staring at her from across the table. And they sat down together, and it turns out that Claire is from Irene's past. She grew up with them until her father died, and then she was raised by her aunts. And Irene hadn't seen her since then, but Claire was really happy to reconnect. And while they're talking, they have a conversation about passing, where Irene is happy to be able to do it every so often. But she married a black man, and is very happy about being black and works to uplift other black people. Claire, meanwhile, seems to be distancing herself from black individuals, mostly because she married a white man who doesn't know that she's black, and makes great efforts to be within that community whenever possible. And a short while later, Claire takes Irene to meet her husband Jack, along with another friend Gertrude, who has the ability to pass. And Jack pretty much, he calls, we find out that Jack calls Claire Nig, short for the racial expletive, because he says that she was pale when they first met, but now she's grown a bit darker, and she might be turning black soon. And he notes that he would not marry her if she were black. And he doesn't really have a great opinion of black individuals, which angers Irene because she has to sit there and take it while he's talking about all of this. And it's further exacerbated by the fact that like she's not really sure she wants to be friends with Claire, and so she after this conversation is over, she decides that she doesn't want to talk with Claire ever again. A short while later, we see Irene with her husband Brian. They have 2 children. And Irene's relationship is somewhat stressful with Brian. He seems sort of like he has wanderlust. He wants to travel and not stay in the country, mostly because the country doesn't seem to like him. And there's a lot of racial tension, especially at the time that this was written. However, Claire makes it known that she wants to visit Irene again, especially in letter form, which we saw at the beginning of the story. And when Irene doesn't answer, Claire just visits Irene at her home, and they have a conversation again about passing and how Claire feels that even though it's risky, to have this relationship with Jack and all of that, like she thinks that she can do it, and especially because she doesn't hang out with the Black community so much. Although she wants to make an effort to do it, especially when Jack isn't around, and so she commits with Irene to go to the NWL dance, the Negro Welfare League, and despite Irene not wanting her to go, she promises to take her along and have a good time. They develop somewhat of a new friendship, although again Irene isn't so kosher with Claire, because Claire is outspoken and seems to be a little bit dangerous, and there's a suspicion that she might be trying to get with Irene's husband Brian, which Irene just puts that out of her mind. And Claire also reveals that she's a dangerous, sort of ruthless kind of person. Irene noting that she has a having way. She's got to have what she wants to have, and she won't stop until she gets what she wants. Irene begins to sense more relationship strain, but again, she tries to put anything out of her mind that Brian will leave her, or that Claire might be cheating or having this affair with her husband, and that Irene can't really call it out, because if she tells Claire's husband, that will reveal the truth about Claire, and there's some of that racial solidarity there. And this is made worse when Irene runs into Jack while she's out with one of her Black friends. But again, she doesn't want to reveal anything, so she just pretends like she doesn't know Jack. And one of her friends is like, like I see you've been passing lately, noting that like she has to maintain 2 different identities there. A short while later, both Irene and Claire and their families are invited to a party at Felice's. Jack isn't invited, but he does show up, and he finds out that Claire is Black, and he calls her out and says some really insensitive things there. And at that point, Irene feels really bad and senses that the absolute worst is going to happen, that Claire will break up with Jack, and that Brian will leave her for Claire, and Irene doesn't want that, so she walks over to Claire while a window is open, which Irene opened to get some air in the first place, and like she grabs onto Claire, and it's insinuated that Irene pushed Claire out the window, and Claire is pronounced dead on the scene with Jack seemingly to blame, and it's implied that she pushed her, but it's also insinuated that she might have passed out. It's a bit unclear there, left up to the reader. And as the story comes to a close, Irene is filled with so much anguish at the sight of her dead friend. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit worth talking about with passing. It's one of those stories that kind of builds and is mostly psychological, and you don't realize what Nella Larsen is doing until the very, very end, and then it all just hits you, and it's just like, bam, this story was a real change of pace for me. I don't read a lot of those psychological stories. I'm much more of a plot person, but there is some plot here. Just the focus is on the psychological element, focusing on the psychology of race. Although, as I'll note later, like a lot of people say this story isn't so much about race. But that said, one of the themes that Larsen is touching upon here is the idea of passing, racial passing, and race in general. Both Irene and Claire are able to pass as non-Black. Irene seems to do it just to be able to get something out of life that she might not already have. Like she stops at the Drayton, which apparently is segregated, because she's like the sun is beating down on her and she's dehydrated, and it seems like something out of convenience more so than anything else, just a little token that life seems to grant her in exchange for being one of the oppressed people out of life. Meanwhile, Claire, for her, this seems to be a little bit of a game, for Claire to be able to pass is an opportunity to get one over perhaps the people who raised her, the white individuals, her white aunts, but to get one over Jack as well. Like it's a game. Maybe she understands what she's doing. Perhaps it's the case that she doesn't. I think the end of the story is more clear that she does know what she's doing, and that she's able to pass. Like, this is a reckless opportunity for her. Like, she wasn't able to be reckless or bold when she was a child because her parents were abusive towards her, specifically her father. And so this is her opportunity to explore and figure out more about who she is. And it's important to think about how this relates back to being Black and in that aspect. Because Irene does seem to care about race. Like, it seems important to her. She's part of the Negro Welfare League. She seems to give back to her community. There is sort of a racial solidarity there for her. It's a connection between the people who have been oppressed, Pan-Africanism, as other authors have ascribed to it. Whereas Claire seems reckless. It's more exploratory for her. Like, she was able to pretend to be white, and now that she's met Irene, this is her opportunity to get back in with the people of color. But she doesn't seem to have like a connection there. Like, she wouldn't go out of her way to help those individuals who were like her, especially if Jack were in the situation, because she would try to distance herself to say, "Oh, I'm not Black. I'm clearly white like you. Let's get married and have children and have this great life together." And racial solidarity is an even bigger factor when you consider that Irene refuses to narc on Claire to her husband, partially because she does feel that Brian, her husband, would leave her for Claire if that opportunity arose. But also because there's that sense of racial solidarity. There's that sense that if Claire were to be found out, like, her life would be destitute. Like, she would lose any and all opportunities. And so it's best to help her, like, stand up with what little apparent privilege that she has, and rather than, rat her out like that. So even though she has the opportunity, she refuses to do that. And again, as I mentioned before, passing does seem to be a game to Claire. That seems to be the word of the day. A game. Like, much of the story is a game to Claire, and in a way that gets you to question, like, who is this person? What is going through her mind? Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. As if aware of her desire and her hesitation, Claire remarked thoughtfully, "You know, Renee, I've often wondered why more colored girls like you and Margaret Hammer and Esther Dawson and, lots of others, never passed over. It's such a frightfully easy thing to do. If one's the type, all that's needed is a little nerve." And that's a really weird thing to think, oh, it's easy fooling other people, not pretending to be who you actually are, but pretending to be another race entirely. Like, it certainly suggests that Claire is a bit of a daredevil, a bit of a risk taker, as if anything else in the story didn't suggest that as well. And she's like, oh, why don't other people do it? And you can see the obvious danger there, because, like, what people don't like to be fooled, especially white people during this time. And if you play this kind of game, it has dangerous prizes, and then great things could happen. Like, you could end up like Claire in a very successful relationship, but you could also be targeted if people were to find out the awful truth there. And what's really interesting is how they both note, like Irene and Claire both note, that, like, white people are clueless to all of this going on around them, despite notions of race and eugenics, that there's a certain way that Black people look, there's a certain bone structure, that weird racial science that existed in the late 1800s and early 1900s that sought to say, Black people are this way and white people are that way and Latinos are this way. But here's Nella Larsen saying that's not the case. You can easily fool white people. There is no set biological standard of race. It's purely an illusion here. And Claire is a great example of how if you play into that illusion, or if you're reckless enough, you can fool anyone you want just by capitalizing on the fact that people buy into that illusion. Another interesting element of this story is Clare and Irene's friendship. I put friendship in quotes because it's a very unusual type of friendship. One, because it might be something more than that, but also it's clear that Irene doesn't even like Clare. Like, it seems hostile, and yet there's something deeper to it. Every instance we see of Irene around Clare, it's initially like, oh, I don't want to be around her, tell her that I'm not home, I don't want to take her calls, I don't want to write a letter back to her, I feel like she's trying to steal my husband, I feel like she's trying to hurt me, and her husband is a jerk, and she doesn't seem to be consciously aware of how she's hurting the racial cause by being with someone like Jack, and so it does seem at first glance like it's hostile and there's nothing much deeper there, but like when you look deeper, you see something more significant. Like you get differing views on race, whereas again Irene is very much invested, whereas Clare is kind of not there. Irene seems to hate Clare. At one point, she says that Clare would be better suited to life in French society or something like that, because you know, the way her personality is, like, she's not very smart, but she is smart in a very, you know, knowing the rules and norms of society kind of way, knowing what she can get away with there, which is a very harsh thing to say about somebody. Like, oh, you're not suited for this world, but maybe in another world because you're not quite as smart as you maybe think you are. That suggests that Irene just can't stand Clare, and I would never say that about someone that I liked being around. So kind of really harsh, and like it's fascinating that Larsen is able to, you know, write that kind of friendship there. But what really gets me here, and what I noticed, and what other other critics have certainly noticed, are the homosexual undertones. And I know what you're saying, like, oh, can't two women just be friends, and like they enjoy hanging around each other, and they're close and whatnot. But I think I think if we examine this, we see that there's a lot of instances where Larsen writes the desire that Clare has for Irene, or that Irene has for Clare. They seem to not like one another, but they can't stop being around one another. They get incredibly close, and like, you could argue, oh, they're just friends, but I feel like that's something that, you know, straight white males like me always say about women who hang out together. Like, oh, they can't be in a relationship, they're just friends. That's the historical underlying, while ignoring the fact that these people might have lived together or been very intimate in some ways. And Clare and Irene aren't really intimate, although there is instances where they touch each other, and Larsen lingers on that moment, and it seems like there's an understated, underground kind of desire for one having towards the other, or both of them having for one another. And so that element is there in this story, and I think that's something that's worth discussing even further if you wanted to do that out there. But then the question arises, you know, does Irene kill Clare at the end of the story? Because you wouldn't do that to a friend, and you certainly wouldn't do that to someone you love, maybe. And the question is, you could say, yes, Irene does kill Clare because she's afraid that Claire is going to run off with her husband, a fit of jealousy on both sides. Like, maybe she wants to be the one to run off with Clare, or maybe she's just mad that she's running off with her husband. So you could argue that. But you could also argue that Irene does not kill Clare because she's incapable of doing so. And she's filled with so much anguish that it couldn't be possible for her to do that. That she simply walked over to Clare and Clare fainted. That it was nothing more than that. It just seems like that because, you know, we're predisposed to believing, you know, the worst out of people. And but I think that the friendship is strong enough that maybe Irene doesn't kill Clare, that it's more passing out. But there is a certain kind of element there to be noted, that Irene is somewhat jealous of Clare, and that might have fueled some anger that could have led to her death. Another thing worth noting in the story is the emotional and psychological storytelling. Most of the story takes place in Irene's mind. You're not really given a whole lot of of plot in terms of what happens in the story. It's mostly told from what Irene is thinking and the rage and the fear and uncertainty that she feels in regards to Clare, because we see that she meets Clare, she meets her husband, we see her interaction with Brian, her husband, there's the dance, and then there's the final party. Not a lot, it's a very short story, not a whole lot of plot there, but we do get a good insight into Irene's fear, doubts, anger, and grief, especially when she sees that her friend has died, that maybe her own anger has potentially led to Claire's death. I really like how Larsen writes all of this, that she doesn't simply want to focus on the plot element, she focuses more internally, all of the things going through Irene's mind, and we feel sadness and kind of anger at what she's doing, and we see the jealousy, and it makes it easier for us to sympathize and understand the grief that she's feeling at the end of the story. We also see a little bit of Clare in the story. She's not the primary focus. It's definitely more on Irene, but we see how a lot of her motivation comes from her childhood trauma. Like, she was abused by her father, and when her father died, we see that Larsen has written that Clare cries in a weird, strange way while everyone's standing around her, but then she stops, and that's it. No more tears for this man who was abusive to her. And then she moves on to her aunts, and that's sort of the last we see of Clare until she's an adult. But a lot of that motivation can guide you and help understand why she might be pursuing Jack. Like, she might be trying to get closer to her father in that way, or she might be trying to, examine her own dysfunction. Maybe there's a lot in her mind that isn't quite right, that there's a mental illness that isn't being fully explored, and it comes from that childhood trauma. And maybe Clare isn't even really seeking Brian. Maybe that's just something that Irene suspects because she sees a confident woman and suspects that her husband is plotting to leave her. But maybe that's not really the case. So it is fascinating how we're not really told a lot about Clare, but that we are told, that which we are told is gives us a lot to think about, especially as it pertains to her motivation throughout the story and why she might be engaging in such risky behavior. And despite all these great things, there is just one problem, or two problems really, that I've noted in this story. It does feel a little bit too short. Like Larsen, it's like 160, 150 or so pages long, and it does feel like Larsen could have elaborated more on this and added more. But maybe if that had happened, it might have overstayed its welcome. So I can understand why she stopped it where she chose to stop it. And the whole cheating thread does seem to come out of nowhere in this story. It kind of feels like there isn't really, or like it was an unnecessary addition that causes a rift between Clare and Irene, and maybe there could have been a better way to establish that uncertainty and kind of hostile feelings, especially if the story was a little bit longer. Maybe that's what that cheating thread is the necessary bit that leads to the point where there is no return for Irene or Clare. But I feel like that's maybe just my opinion there. I feel like other people might have seen it as a very necessary, and it could also help further explain, the relationship between Irene and Clare and the feelings of homosexuality latent underneath all of that. Because if Irene's husband Brian doesn't want to be with her, then maybe that is an opportunity for her to be with Clare. Something to think about there. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Passing by Nella Larsen. A really solid, really great addition to the Harlem Renaissance writers of the 1920s. And again, as I noted before, like Nella Larsen wrote only like 2 books in her entire life, and this is one of them. It's such a fantastic book, and she's she has such a limited sort of bibliography, and for this to be one of them is just, it says a lot about her power and her quality of writing. I would like to read the other book that she wrote, Quicksand, I believe it is, so be on the lookout for that in the future. And again, I strongly recommend that you go seek out and read this because it's worth your time. Again, comment below if you have anything to say about what I said here. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people people can find out about this author or this book if they don't already know, and join the Discord if you want to further have a conversation about Nella Larsen's writing. But until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and friendship travels. Farewell.